Hi guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at a Rivals of Ixalan sealed PPTQ I played on March 3rd. This was one of the weekends where I didn't have the opportunity to travel to a standard PPTQ, so instead I decided to gain some familiarity with Magic Online's PPTQ system. A little bit of background about what I knew about the format before playing this sealed event. Most of my knowledge had been gained from limited resources, and their strategy for the best deck in the format was a Sailor of Means deck, which stretches everything out to late game and splashes for all of the bombs. This is because this is a Prince heavy format, meaning that the rares are so much more powerful than the rest of the cards that the majority of the time you want to play them. So if you have good fixing in the form of Sailor of Means or some of your other cards like Traveler's Amulet, you can play all of your rares, all of your bomb rares, and hopefully by stretching the game out, you'll win through the power level of those rares. I think forcing this deck was one of the biggest flaws in the construction port of this event. I didn't really open any super powerhouse rares, and I think I should have recognized that we were likely supposed to be building a more aggressive deck with the amount of removal we had in white and black, just trying to force through the last points of damage based on those removal spells, that is. Excuse me. So you'll see at the moment we're in Esper colors. This was primarily due to the fact that the rares we did open, 2 of them were in white. White was our deepest color with a reasonable amount of playable creatures. All of our best removal was in black, and then we had a number of good flyers and the Sailor of Means in blue. So we recognized these as the colors we wanted to be in, and we also decided we were going to splash red for the unblockable pirate, which you can see pictured there. This was because we wanted to win the game through a series of flyers and unblockable creatures to just punch through for those last points of damage when the ground stalled up. So we also had the ability to splash for that red pirate due to having 2 dual lands, the Highland Lake and the Stone Quarry. And along with the Sailor of Means, we were hopeful that this was enough fixing to play red. However, we didn't really have any other fixing in the deck, so we were prized into playing the best cards in red rather than green. So that pretty much sums up our strategy for the construction part. I believe there were some mistakes made here. Primarily, we should have identified that we should have been an aggressive deck rather than trying to stretch the game out to the late game. So as this construction portion wraps up, I'll just describe a little bit about what we're going to do today. And that is we're going to go through a number of the mistakes that were made in the game as well as throughout the event. As well as just showing you sort of what took place in each of the rounds. So some things are going to be sped up. We're going to hop around a little bit and just go through the mistakes that were made in each game. And hopefully that gives you a good overview of how the entire event went without having you sit here for 6 hours and having me talk for 6 hours. So before we get into round 1, I'm going to grab a quick drink. And we'll discuss everything in terms of theory, roles, and having a plan that we should have identified that maybe we did not, or that we did identify and just didn't work out in our favor. So here we are in Game 1, Round 1. At this point, we've been achieving the beatdown roll. We currently have their creature locked down with a 2/5, and we have 2/3 flyers. However, at this moment, whenever our opponent plays a charging monster sword, the rules switch, and we kind of failed to recognize that the rules switched. We sort of defaulted to go into a racing strategy, and I don't believe that's the correct play whenever your opponent has a charging monster sword and clearly has a bigger late game than you do, because of the way the red-green archetype matches up against blue-white, or in our case Esper primarily. All of their creatures are going to be bigger, so we don't really want to get... we need to end the game, but we also don't have a good strategy for winning this race currently. What we ended up deciding to do was to play the Sailor of Means, actually both of them, and just chump block Monster Sword, trying to get in for 4 to 6 points of damage on our end, and eventually take the game that way. However, this strategy doesn't end up paying off as our opponent completely stalls our air game with a grazing whiptail, which you will see played here in a moment. And I believe that's the moment where we really should have identified that our strategy wasn't going to work. And you will see us slow down just a tad and attempt to trade for the charging Monstrosaur, I do believe. We also kind of misevaluated this recover because we actually end up deciding at some point that we can attack through the grazing whiptail, just punch in for 4 to 6 points of damage depending on how they block, or rather 2 to 4 depending on how they block, and just return whatever dies to the grazing whiptail with the recover. However, I don't believe that was a good strategy on our part. It's likely that we should have been trying to trade very aggressively with this charging Monstrosaur and then hope to draw a removal spell or two so that we can continue to get to attack our opponent effectively. Instead, we essentially just decided to chump attack repeatedly. So I believe this was the primary reason we lost this game, was due to the fact that we misassigned rules. We didn't really foresee that the rules had changed whenever that charging Monstrosaur and the grazing whiptail came down. Instead, we just continued to try to punch through for a few points of damage in the air. This particular play, I also believe, has mistakes, as I mentioned. We're going to attack and then use recover to return whatever flyer gets blocked by the whiptail. I believe instead we should have probably either not attacked, waited for our opponent to attack and use this Divine Verdict to kill the charging Monstrosaur, or attacked, used the Divine Verdict to kill the whiptail, and then continued to chump block the Monstrosaur. However, we made a worse play and didn't do either of those things. We instead used our recover in an aggressive manner to attack in for 4 damage, then return the flyer. You'll see in a moment why this doesn't work out for us, and I don't believe it was the highest value play that we could have made on this turn. The whiptail had such a negative effect on our strategy that it should have just been dealt with right there as soon as it was declared as a blocker. So we punch in for 4 damage and kill the whiptail instead of returning our own creature and only getting in for 4 damage. Here we're going to replay our flyer so that we can get in for the most damage next turn. You can see if we do get to untap after playing this flyer, we can kill the whiptail with Impale and hopefully take the game next turn. So it was a fairly close decision. However, I believe there were multiple small decisions leading up to this point which prevented us from ultimately winning the game. When our opponent plays this unfriendly fire here, it really signals the beginning of the end for us, as they believe they can win the race, and they had a large source of damage that we hadn't accounted for. So when two players both are racing, one of them's ultimately wrong, and in this case it was us. And based on the card quality for each of our 2 archetypes, I think we should have identified that we were less likely to win the race and adjusted our game plan to follow suit. We took a long time figuring out these blocks. It's 3/4. So if we block there, we take 6. Oh no, because we're trampling over 1 for the Monstrosaur. So if we block like this, we die. We almost did block like this, thinking that we could chump block and then have them chump attack with 1. However, we would have actually died here. So instead, we have to block the grazing whiptail or one of the 3-power creatures. We also can't block the other 3-power creature because of its enrage ability, which would deal 2 damage to us, and we would once again die. So we were forced into blocking in this manner, which essentially eliminates our whole board, and that's the end of the game. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 3. I'm trying to see now if we missed lethal. With the Forerunner, we could have gone and got another Forerunner, which would do 1 extra damage, getting our opponent down to 5. But I think we're still a mana or 2 short of being able to trigger it again to finish our opponent off. So I don't believe we missed lethal there. However, it may have been worth it to see if we had a 1 or 2 power or 1 or 2 cost pirate in our deck. It doesn't appear that we do. So for sideboarding, we just decided to bring in some high toughness creatures like Headwater Sentries or the Looming Armasaur, so that we had an answer for the Charging Monstrosaur. And we can save our removal spells for the Grazing Whiptail. And the Looming Armasaur even would answer a Colossal Dreadmaw, which it's quite possible for our opponent to have. As you can see, I'm showing you our mulligan decisions here. I think we kind of just had stretched our mana base too far with the 4-color, and we were really struggling to cast our spells. We ended up keeping this 5-card hand, even though it doesn't do much of anything, because in Sealed we really don't want to go down below 5 cards, and I'd rather have 4 lands in a 5-card hand so that any spells we draw we can actually cast. Here we also made a mistake. We thought the Orazca Relic added 1 mana of any color, and you can see this is the moment we realize it, and we pretty much concede right away because we have no chance left in that game anyway. Alright, so we're going to be going on to round 2. This round, we pretty much lost just due to the power level of our deck compared to our opponents, so sorry for the spoilers. We are going to lose this round. It's going to go by pretty quickly here. That was just a mulligan decision I wanted to show you guys. As you can see, our opponent has the Jimenez Climb, or whatever that card is called, and we thought we had just managed to survive another turn. However, the Flash Dinosaur spells the end of our lives as well. So, wasn't a whole lot we could have done there. We stumbled on mana just a tad, I believe, but still not too many decisions to be made that we messed up there. This game, we are once again going to stumble on mana slightly, I believe. I'm just letting it go by very quickly because I don't believe there were too many critical decisions to be made. It was just sort of a combination of the power level of our opponent's deck and the way our draws lined up that we were unable to really stand much of a chance. Perhaps playing Mark of the Vampire on that our 3/1 flyer wasn't correct. We possibly should have just continued to play out to the board. However, we didn't have another 4-mana spell, so I just kind of defaulted to the heuristic that you should play your most expensive spell at a given time, and especially when I was going to be attacking for 5 with lifelink against 6 power for my opponent. So just the way this draw kind of lined up, we very quickly were dying. Our opponent has 2 large hexproof creatures, which are beating us down, and a number of flyers and difficult to deal with creatures. So essentially, our opponent's deck was just better at what we were trying to do than we were. So that's sort of the way that goes sometimes. Round 3, this once again, our opponent had, or no, this, sorry, I got confused about which round we are. So we end up having a really aggressive draw for game 1. And this is due to the fact that we found our Forerunner of the Coalition, and we were able to begin triggering it multiple times. We actually decide to loop our Forerunners so that we get 2 life. This provides us with a little bit of additional reach. That is, we drain our opponent for 2 each time we play a pirate. So this provides us with some additional reach and allows us to finish the game a little bit more quickly. Our opponent also, as you may notice, is stumbling on mana quite severely, which is the main reason, more than likely, that we were able to complete this beatdown so quickly and so thoroughly. And that's just sort of the way this matchup went. So moving into round 4, we're 1 and 2. We have no ability to top 8, obviously, but we have the ability to get a prize and continue to learn from this experience. So go ahead and keep this removal heavy hand. It has one of our rares, the sweeper. However, we're playing against what appears to be a white black vampires deck, and the Mastermind's Acquisition is a terrifying card. I've had some trouble with it in Standard as well. And as you'll see, our opponent went and got another Standard powerhouse in, I believe it's called Profane Procession. Yeah, and all I could do to try to take care of this was to just play out a number of creatures until it flips, and then basically 6-for-1 myself. And so we just conceded that game pretty quickly. Once again, our opponent plays this Mastermind's Acquisition. I was fairly certain the game was just done at this point. However, I decided to try to get in as much damage as quickly as possible, and the Ixalan's Binding actually gave us a chance. So we just started our beatdown roll. Unfortunately for us, our opponent didn't get Profane Procession. Instead, they got this Waking Sun's Avatar, I believe, and wiped our board. We were able to set up a plan where we use Divine Verdict to take care of the Waking Sun's Avatar, and then the game continued from there. Fortunately for us, we drew better than our opponent for the following turns, even having Ixalan's Binding for the Profane Procession. So we've basically eliminated three of our opponent's rares, which were all better than pretty much every card in our deck, and we actually managed to get a semi-decent aggro plan going again after a bit of grinding. It's possible we should have attacked with Sailor of Means there and then used Moment of Craving to finish off the Sentry. This game had some long grindy moments, as mentioned previously. But the real decision points have already been made in this game, where we committed to the board. We didn't know our opponent had a sweeper. They got us fairly well with that sweeper, but we were able to answer the Waking Sun's Avatar and his other rare, Profane Procession. So at this point, it was just a fairly even playing field between the power level of our two decks, and we have enough evasion creatures with evasion that we're actually able to pull the win out of this game. So this was the first time that our deck had really functioned the way we anticipated, where we gummed up the board and then used our evasive creatures to finish off our opponent. Even though it took us quite a while, that was our initial strategy. And we'll be taking this round to a game 3, despite the power level of our opponent's deck being considerably higher than the power level of our own. Alright, so we're here for game 3 of round 4. We boarded into a more aggressive white-black base deck for this last round, or for this last game. I believe we boarded out the Erasca Relic and perhaps the red splash as well. Unfortunately, so far we've stumbled on black mana. However, we were once again able to line up Ixalan's Binding with a Profane Procession. I believe that is why we actually kept the hand, because Profane Procession is just unbeatable for our deck by any other means. So at this point, things are looking pretty dire for us. We really need to find black mana to be able to do much of anything in the coming turns. And we are being hit for large chunks of damage each turn. Our opponent's creatures are continuing to improve thanks to Ascend. We're just very much struggling to stabilize, falling further and further behind with each turn. Partially due to our lack of black mana. Of the cards in hand, we can currently only cast 2 of them, and we could cast all of them if we had a single black mana earlier in the game. However, we kind of prized ourselves into that, attempting to play a 4-colored deck with only some mediocre fixing in the form of Sailor of Means and 2 dual lands. So that puts us at 1-3. We're no longer able to get a prize in this event. However, we're going to continue to play for the experience. Here you'll see our opponent play a turn 5 Charging Monstrosaur, and we are quite behind, having stumbled on mana, and having a hand that is clogged up with a bit of removal. Fortunately for us, that works well against what our opponent has to offer. We decided here to Impale rather than use Legion's Judgment just for the mana efficiency. Legion's Judgment, we also could have used the Bishop of Binding to take out the Charging Monstrosaur, which seems good. It seems like that would allow us to attack with the 6/6 on the Crackback. However, if our opponent has a removal spell for the Bishop of Binding, because it's a fairly fragile creature, we end up getting attacked for 6 again because of the haste on the Charging Monstrosaur. So that's why we decided to choose Impale over Bishop of Binding and Impale over Legion's Judgment because of the mana efficiency. Here we have the option to use the Bishop of Binding to take out the what is the name of that card? Overgrown something. And this works out a lot better because that creature doesn't have haste. And as predicted, our opponent does have the removal spell, which you'll see on their turn. So I was pretty proud that we were able to play around that portion at least. However, it still leaves us in a fairly bad position to win this game, considering our opponent will have 2 or 3 creatures against our 0 after this removal spell. So the Hunt the Weak actually allows our opponent to get a 3/3 token as well, so we're falling farther and farther behind. However, luckily for us, our Plains arrives on time. We're able to use our rare to wipe the board. This was actually an ideal moment to cast it anyway, because our opponent couldn't keep any combination of 2 creatures. They were stuck with 1 no matter which they took, and they obviously chose the 4/4 over the 2/2 Enrage or the 3/3. At this point, we still have a ton of removal in hand. It's just a matter of really finding a creature or 2 that we can start getting in for damage, and having the opportunity to cast them early, because at this point our opponent's just pumping out threat after threat, and we're constantly having to use our removal spells on them. Down to 3 life here. We could die to a burn spell at any moment, but we weren't beating one at this point anyway. So we're finally we finally drawn out of our mana screw, and we're able to play 1 or 2 turns, or 2 spells a turn. We decide to wait here and play the Divine Verdict. Our opponent immediately sacrifices that for 1 damage to us. I'm not sure exactly why they did that. But we've finally stabilized here at 2 life. If our opponent finds a burn spell this turn, we're dead. If not, we have Mark of the Vampire to put on our Horsey. I have no idea what the name of the card is. And turn it into a 7/7 thanks to Ascend. And begin turning this game around. So I believe the way we sequenced our removal spells earlier was pretty critical. Again, I walked through it once already. However, I believe we did optimize the way we used those removal spells, and it led to us eventually winning this game. So that I wanted to highlight one of the things we did right after going through so many of the things we did wrong in this event. Sorry about that, guys. So that's essentially how game 1 shaped up. We do decide to go ahead and use Ixalan's Binding here. We do kind of get punished for it as well, you'll see coming up. However, my thought process was, with no cards in hand for our opponent, they have to find an answer to our creature this turn, or they'll be dead next turn. So we just go ahead and try to force through 3 points of damage here, and play our second creature. We apparently don't play our second creature, so that's a mistake. No idea why we didn't do that. Force the chump block here as well. And now play our second creature. Definitely a mistake there. I believe we would have won this game had we correctly identified that we could have played that second creature last turn. No idea why we made such a silly mistake. Our opponent actually almost punishes us for it by playing this Holtai, I believe is the name of that Planeswalker. It allows them to trade for a 3/3. However, they still had the top deck to really be able to come back. We send both of them to force the chump block with a 3/3. Thinking that once again, if they don't find a creature off the top of their deck, we would win this coming turn. So again, just forcing our opponent to have a card that affects the board turn after turn after turn. If they draw a land for any of these particular turns, we would win the game. That was a great draw in particular for our opponent because it allowed them to use Holtai to gain life, so that we couldn't just attack with both creatures to win the game. At this point, we had to decide between attacking our opponent or attacking the Planeswalker. The Planeswalker's minus ability is that you take off counters from it and do that much damage to any number of creatures that your opponents control, divided that way. So in order to keep our fly around, we had to attack Holtai. So we're just continuing to develop out our board, and they are continuing to gain life. So this game is slipping away from us. We're ahead in the time race. We're also ahead on board. Just drawing another flyer there was great for us. Once again, we're attacking the Planeswalker to make sure we don't lose our board to its minus ability. We take out this Frillback so that they can't gain 4 life every turn, and play our second creature, our fourth creature, our second flyer. And we did continue to draw well throughout this entire span as well. the first time our opponent has drawn a land in the last 5 turns probably was really spelled the end of the game for them, especially considering that we didn't have another land on top and we had a source of card selection. This really was the final nail in the coffin when they drew another land in a row. So that was just a brief synopsis of the Rivals of Ixalan sealed PPTQ I played in. There were a lot of mistakes to be made, a lot of areas to improve, and lessons learned. However, I was frustrated with the construction part of this as I finished this event up. I apologize, guys. I'm going to take this back over here. So as we finished this event up, I was fairly frustrated with the construction part of this. So after this PPTQ ended, I immediately joined a draft league and played through a draft league and actually got the first trophy I've had on Magic Online. So that video will be coming to you guys shortly. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned along with me and found some entertainment from some of the mistakes I made. And I look forward to hearing your criticism and improving alongside you. Thank you.